The inbred empire that makes the Habsburgs look normal. Let us begin with a confession. The Habsburgs were not idiots. They knew what they were doing came with risks. When Philip II of Spain married his niece Anna of Austria in 1570, the church had to issue a special dispensation, because marrying your sibling's child was considered a little too close for even Renaissance royalty. Philip did it anyway. He got a son, the future Philip III, who was healthy enough to rule and foolish enough to bankrupt his father's empire. The Habsburg calculus was simple: keep the thrones in the family, even if the family starts looking a little unusual. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the Spanish Habsburgs had been marrying uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, and double first cousin to double first cousin for over a century and a half. Charles's inbreeding coefficient, the probability that he inherited two identical copies of a gene from a common ancestor, was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. Specifically, 0.254. For context, the child of a full sibling union has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was essentially the genetic equivalent of an incest baby, spread out over 4 generations of slightly more distant but relentlessly repetitive pairings. His body told the story. The famous Habsburg jaw was not merely a strong chin. It was a mandibular prognathism so extreme that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. He could not chew. He swallowed his food whole, which gave him chronic digestive distress. His tongue was too large for his mouth, so his speech was a wet, slurred murmur. His head was disproportionately large. His body was weak, prone to fevers, convulsions, and what physicians called a general trembling of the limbs. He did not learn to speak until age 4. He did not walk until age 8. He was, by most accounts, gentle and affectionate, but he was also functionally incompetent as a ruler. Foreign ambassadors described him as looking more like a ruined building than a man. When Charles died in 1700, childless and dissected by autopsy, his single atrophied testicle was noted with clinical horror. He triggered the War of the Spanish Succession. His jaw was so severe that he could not close his mouth even in death. The Habsburg line in Spain ended with a man who could barely eat, speak, or reproduce. For all their notoriety, the Habsburgs were restrained compared to what we are about to discuss. They married outside the immediate family often enough to introduce fresh blood every generation or two. They had cousins and uncles and aunts from other dynasties, Bourbons, Wittelsbachs, Medici, who occasionally wandered into the gene pool with a healthy set of chromosomes. Charles II was a catastrophe, but he was one catastrophe. The rest of his family, while ugly and prone to stillbirths, mostly functioned. They rode horses. They signed decrees. They started wars. They were, in the miserable way of European royalty, normal. The dynasty we are about to examine had no such luck. No such restraint. No such outside blood. They looked at the Habsburgs and said, quietly at first, then with theological certainty, not enough. The Carstchen anomaly. Somewhere in the mountainous knot where the Alps fray into the Dinarides, a region that has belonged, at various times, to Austria, Croatia, Slovenia, and the Ottoman Empire, there lies a valley that does not appear on any modern map. Not because it has been intentionally erased, but because it has been forgotten. The roads that led there washed out in the 19th century. The rail lines bypassed it. The last census that recorded its name was printed on paper that turned to dust sometime around 1912. The locals, what few remain, call it Zartish, the hidden place. But for 3 centuries, it was known by another name, the Carstchen March. And for those 3 centuries, it was ruled by a family so profoundly, systematically, theologically inbred that the Habsburgs would have looked like genetic tourists. The House of Habsburg, known colloquially as the Threadbones, for reasons we shall explore, did not stumble into consanguinity. They worshipped it. Their founding charter, the Compact of the Unbroken Circle, written in 1523 by Margrave Ulrich the Unspilled, contained the following clause, which was read aloud at every coronation for the next 300 years. Let no drop of the Aelfwine blood pass into foreign veins. Let no stranger's seed corrupt the sacred line. For as the serpent eats its own tail and becomes infinite, so shall the family that marries only itself become eternal. The circle is unbroken. The blood is one. The throne is the womb. This was not pragmatic politics, the usual royal motive for marrying close relatives to keep land and titles consolidated. This was doctrine. Ulrich had convinced himself, and then his priests, and then his terrified subjects, that genetic isolation was the path to immortality. He believed that the Habsburgs had failed not because they married their nieces but because they stopped. They diluted the essence. They let French and Italian and Portuguese blood pollute the Austrian perfection. Ulrich intended to do better. He began modestly. He married his own first cousin, a woman named Hedwig who shared his mother's father. They produced 3 children, 2 of whom survived infancy, a son, Ulrich II, and a daughter, Matilda. So far, nothing worse than what the Medici had done. But then Ulrich the Unspilled did something that made even his confessor blanch. He decreed that Matilda would marry Ulrich II. Brother to sister. Same parents. Same blood. The confessor, a Fra Sebastian of the Dominican order, wrote a panicked letter to Rome. The letter never arrived. Ulrich had the roads watched. Fra Sebastian was found at the bottom of a limestone sinkhole 3 weeks later, his rosary wrapped so tightly around his neck that the beads had embedded in the flesh. The official cause of death was a regrettable misstep in foggy conditions. Ulrich II and Matilda married in the autumn of 1531. She was 14. He was 16. Their first child, a boy named Odolf, was born with one eye smaller than the other and a cleft palate so severe that he could not suckle. He died at 3 weeks. Their second child, a girl, was born with her heart on the right side of her chest, a condition called dextrocardia which is compatible with life but unusual. She survived. They named her Hedwig, after her grandmother. Their third child was stillborn. Fused from the waist down like a grotesque mermaid. Ulrich the Unspilled attended each birth, watching from a carved chair at the foot of the birthing bed. According to court chronicles, he smiled at every death. He saw each failure as a refinement, God testing the purity of the line, burning away the imperfect vessels until only the true vessel remained. He did not live to see his grandchildren. In 1547, Ulrich choked on a piece of gristle during a feast celebrating his 45th year on the throne. He refused to let anyone perform the Heimlich maneuver because it would have required a foreign-born physician to touch him. He died purple-faced, slumped into a bowl of gravy, still smiling. His son, Ulrich II, inherited a kingdom of 5,000 terrified peasants, a wife who was also his sister, and a daughter, the surviving Hedwig, who had just turned 12. Ulrich II wasted no time. He married Hedwig to her younger brother, a boy of 10 named Aribert. Aunt to nephew? No. Sister to brother? No. This was father's firstborn daughter to father's secondborn son, full siblings, same parents, same womb, married to each other at the ages of 12 and 10. The local bishop protested. Ulrich II had him drowned in the same sinkhole that had claimed Fra Sebastian. The dynasty had found its ritual disposal site. The genetic math of a closed loop. Before we proceed with the Threadbone saga, let us pause to understand what they were doing to themselves. In ordinary human reproduction, each child inherits half its DNA from its mother and half from its father. Those halves recombine in unique ways, creating genetic variation. This is good. Variation is what allows populations to survive disease, adapt to changing environments, and avoid the expression of recessive harmful mutations. Every person carries a handful of recessive lethal or deleterious alleles, broken genes that, if inherited from both parents, cause disease, deformity, or death. In outbred populations, these recessives rarely meet. A carrier has a 1 in 100 chance of mating with another carrier of the same recessive, and even then, only 25% of children inherit both copies. This is why incest is dangerous. Siblings share, on average, 50% of their DNA. First cousins share 12.5%. When close relatives reproduce, the odds that both carry the same recessive mutation skyrocket. The Habsburgs, with their first cousin and uncle-niece pairings, produced children who were, on average, as inbred as if their parents were half-siblings. Charles II's coefficient of 0.254 meant that more than a quarter of his genome was identical by descent, 2 copies of the same ancestral gene, one from each parent, with no outbreeding to introduce variation. The threadbones, by the third generation, had an average inbreeding coefficient of 0.375. That is higher than the offspring of a full brother-sister pairing 0.25. They had surpassed the incest baseline. How? By marrying siblings to siblings, then marrying their children to each other, then marrying those children back to the original parents, then marrying the grandchildren to the grandparents. They created a pedigree that was not a tree but a knot, a Mobius strip of shared DNA where every individual was simultaneously parent, child, sibling, cousin, aunt, and uncle to every other. By the time of King Rothhard the Trembling reigned 1692 to 1711, the entire Threadbone dynasty consisted of 28 living individuals, all of whom shared, on average, 68% of their DNA with any randomly selected other member of the family. For comparison, full siblings share 50%. Parent and child share 50%. The Threadbones had become a single, distributed organism, a family that was genetically closer to a clone than a lineage. The results were predictable to anyone who understood basic genetics. Unfortunately, no one in the Carstian March understood basic genetics. What they understood was theology. And theology told them that the deformed children, the stillbirths, the endless miscarriages, the children born without eyes or with 2 rows of teeth or with skin so translucent that their internal organs pulsed visibly beneath the surface, all of this was purification. God was burning away the dross. The survivors, the ones who crawled out of the birthing bed with all their limbs attached and some approximation of a working face, were the elect. The true Threadbones. The living proof that the unbroken circle worked. One such survivor was King Rothhard himself. Rothhard was the product of a union between his mother who was his father's half-sister and his father who was his mother's full cousin and also, by a previous marriage, her step-uncle. He was born with a neurological condition that caused his hands to shake constantly, a familial tremor so severe that he could not hold a cup, sign his name, or point at anything without the gesture resembling a spasmodic wave. He also had a copper metabolism disorder, Wilson's disease, unrecognized at the time, that deposited copper in his liver, brain, and corneas. By age 30, he had the liver function of a cirrhotic alcoholic despite never touching wine. By age 40, he saw golden rings around every light source, the Kayser-Fleischer rings that are pathognomonic for Wilson's. He thought the golden halos were divine visions. He incorporated them into the state religion. Rothhard's reign is remembered for 2 things: the Edict of Concentrated Essence, which mandated even more inbreeding, against all reason, and the construction of the Bone Chapel at Schloss Unkenfurt. The Bone Chapel was exactly what it sounds like. Rothhard ordered that every Threadbone child who died before age 5, and there were many, be exhumed after 5 years and have their femurs, ribs, and skulls incorporated into the chapel's walls. By the time of his death, the chapel contained the remains of 411 children. Their small bones formed archways, altars, and a chandelier that tinkled faintly when the wind blew through the cracks in the stone. Rothhard did not see horror in this. He saw holiness. He used to sit in the bone chapel for hours, running his trembling fingers over the infant skulls, whispering prayers to the unbroken circle. His courtiers, who had grown up in this nightmare, did not find it strange. They had never known anything different. The outside world, however, was beginning to notice. The visitors and their horror. The Castion March was not a secret by design. It was a secret by geography. The valley sat at the bottom of a collapsed limestone plateau, surrounded by cliffs that rose 400 meters on three sides. The only entrance was a narrow gorge called the Wolf's Throat, a kilometer-long passage where the walls leaned inward so steeply that sunlight reached the floor for only 2 hours each day. Most travelers assumed the gorge led nowhere. Those who ventured through found a valley of grey pastures, slow rivers, and a single road that wound toward Schloss Unkenfert, the Threadbone seat. For the first 80 years of the dynasty, few outsiders came. The march produced nothing of value, no silver, no timber, no strategic passes. Its peasants spoke a so distorted from Standard German that even Bavarians couldn't understand them. The Threadbones liked it that way. Isolation was the soil in which their holy experiment grew. But isolation could not last forever. In 1603, a Venetian merchant named Lorenzo Bellini stumbled into the Castion March while fleeing a band of Uskok pirates. His ship had wrecked on the Dalmatian coast. He had walked inland for 2 weeks, eating roots and berries, hoping to find the Adriatic again. Instead, he found Schloss Unkenfert. Bellini was the first outsider to spend more than a night in the Castion March and live to write about it. His account, preserved in the Venetian state archives as Relazione della Terrastorta Report on the Twisted Land, is one of the most disturbing documents of the early modern period. It reads, in part, I came to the castle gate at dusk, expecting hospitality. The gatekeeper was a woman, or what once was a woman. Her face leaned to the left as if her skull had been poured into a crooked mold. One eye was higher than the other by the width of 2 fingers. Her mouth opened sideways, not up and down. When she spoke, I understood nothing. Her tongue, I saw, was forked like a serpent's. I made the sign of the cross. She laughed, and the laugh came from her throat like stones falling down a well. They gave me food. Grey bread. A soup that tasted of iron and ash. I ate because I was starving, but my stomach turned for 3 days afterward. The king, they called him Aribert the Two-Faced, received me in a hall lined with mirrors. I saw my own reflection 50 times, but also his. He had 2 foreheads. Not one face split in 2, but one forehead, a furrow, and then another forehead behind it, like a man wearing a second face on the back of his head. He smiled at me. Half his mouth smiled first. The other half followed after a breath. I wanted to run. I did not run because I could not find the door. Every mirror showed a door, but none were real. I stayed 3 weeks. I was the first Venetian they had seen in 30 years, and they would not let me leave. They wanted me to marry a princess. A princess with no kneecaps, who had to be carried on a velvet pillow. She was 17. Her name was Marceline. She had beautiful hair. Everything below her neck was a question I did not want answered. I escaped on the 22nd night. I climbed the east wall during a thunderstorm. I ran through the Wolf's Throat without stopping, even when I fell and broke 2 teeth. I ran until I reached Austrian soil. I have not stopped running in my mind since. Bellini's report was dismissed in Venice as the ravings of a man who had eaten poisonous mushrooms. No one sent an expedition. No one cared about a valley of deformed lunatics in a mountain range that already had plenty of both. But Bellini's description, the forked tongue, the 2 foreheads, the kneeless princess, would later be cross-referenced with other accounts. The Threadbones were not a hallucination. They were real. And they were getting worse. The architecture of inbreeding. To understand how the Threadbone dynasty sustained itself for 311 years, one must understand the system. Inbreeding on the Habsburg scale was haphazard. A marriage here, a dispensation there, a convenient niece when a queen died in childbirth. The Threadbones, by contrast, built a bureaucracy. The office of Holy Descent was established in 1588 by Queen Marceline, the Eternal Dowager, the kneeless princess from Bellini's account. Its sole purpose was to track every Threadbone blood relationship, calculate the purity percentage of any proposed match, and reject any union that would introduce foreign DNA, defined as DNA from any person who was not a descendant of Ulrich the Unspilled through both parents. Yes, both parents. By 1588, the Threadbones had been intermarrying for 2 generations. That meant that every living Threadbone was already descended from Ulrich through multiple lines. The Office of Holy Descent did not see this as a problem. They saw it as the foundation of a new race. The office employed 16 scribes who worked by candlelight in a windowless room beneath the castle kitchens. They maintained enormous parchment scrolls, family trees that did not branch but rather looped. A typical Threadbone pedigree from 1600 shows a central mass of names connected by lines that look like spilled embroidery floss. The same names appear over and over. Aribert, Marceline, Odolf, Hedwig, Rothard. The scribes assign numbers to each individual, Aribert 1, Aribert 2, Aribert 3, to distinguish the 7 different Ariberts who lived between 1523 and 1700. The office also maintained the Book of Acceptable Deformities, a chilling document that categorized heritable conditions by their severity and their holiness. A cleft palate was considered acceptable but unfortunate. A missing limb was unacceptable unless the missing limb is a leg below the knee, in which case it is neutral. A harelip was holy if it resembles the split hoof of a sacrificial goat. Webbed fingers were holy only if the webbing extends to the second knuckle. Beyond that, it is monstrous. 6 fingers on one hand was extremely holy because it represented the 6 days of creation. 7 fingers was heretical excess. This was not pseudoscience. This was theology applied to anatomy. The Threadbones believed that God spoke through birth defects, that every malformed child was a message, and it was the office's job to decode which deformities were blessings and which were curses. Children born with holy deformities were raised in the palace and groomed for marriage. Children born with monstrous deformities were given to the bone chapel. The scribes who made these decisions were themselves Threadbones, of course. By 1620, the Office of Holy Descent employed exclusively individuals with at least one holy deformity. The chief scribe, a man named Odolf the Bent, he had kyphosis so severe that his chest rested on his thighs, personally approved or denied every marriage for 43 years. He never approved a union that would have introduced fresh blood. He denied every request to marry a foreigner, even when the foreigner was a Habsburg archduke offering a fortune in silver. The Habsburgs, for their part, were aware of the Castilian March but considered it beneath notice. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a man fascinated by oddities and anomalies, he kept a cabinet of curiosities filled with deformed specimens in jars, sent an envoy in 1597 to investigate the rumors of a king with 2 foreheads. The envoy returned after 2 weeks, refused to write a report, and resigned his post. He spent the rest of his life as a Trappist monk, taking a vow of silence. When asked years later about the Castilian March, he wrote on a slate, "They are not men. They are mistakes God decided not to finish." The reproductive crisis of 1630 to 1650. Even the most fervent theology cannot overcome basic biology. By 1630, the Threadbone dynasty faced a crisis that no amount of prayer could solve. They were running out of children. Between 1523 and 1629, the Threadbone birth rate had held steady at approximately 12 live births per decade, low for a royal family, but sustainable. However, the infant mortality rate had climbed from 40% in the first generation to 78% by 1620. Of the children who survived their first year, another 60% died before age 10. The threadbone population, which peaked at 62 individuals in 1615, had fallen to 31 by teat. Surviving adults were not healthy. Queen Marceline, the Eternal Dowager, now in her 60s, ruled from a wheeled platform because she had never developed kneecaps. Her eldest son, Aribert III, called the second-faced like his grandfather, though his deformity was different. He had a fully formed third incisor row behind his upper teeth, was 38 and had already outlived 3 wives. He had produced 17 children. 15 were dead. The 2 survivors, a girl with a cleft palate and a boy with one leg shorter than the other, were both under 10. Aribert III's problem was not a lack of effort. He married his first wife, his first cousin, at 18. She died in childbirth, along with the baby. His second wife was his first wife's younger sister, also his first cousin, who had been raised in the palace as a potential replacement. She bore him 8 children over 12 years. 6 were stillborn. 1 lived for 3 days before its lungs failed. The last, a girl, survived but was unpresentable. The court chronicles do not specify why, but the phrase "her face resembled a clenched fist" appears in a marginal note. Aribert III's third wife was his own niece. She was 14. He was 36. The marriage was approved by the Office of Holy Descent because the niece's mother was Aribert's half-sister, making the genetic distance close enough to be holy but not so close as to be wastefully redundant, a category the office invented specifically for this union. The niece bore him 6 children in 7 years. 4 were stillborn. 1 lived for 11 months before succumbing to what appears to have been a total lack of immune function. The last, a boy named Rothhard after his great-grandfather, was born with the familial tremor that would later define the dynasty. He survived. He would become King Rothhard the Trembling, the man who built the Bone Chapel. But by 1650, even the Office of Holy Descent could not ignore the numbers. The Threadbone dynasty had produced 38 children in the previous 20 years. 29 had died before age 5. Of the 9 survivors, 3 were so severely disabled that they could not walk, 2 could not speak, and 1, a girl named Edburga, was born without a palate, meaning that when she drank milk, it came out her nose. She learned to eat by tilting her head back and pouring food directly down her throat. She lived to be 63. The crisis came to a head in 1652, when a delegation of Threadbone nobles, the few who were not members of the immediate royal family, approached Queen Marceline with an unprecedented request. They asked her to suspend the Edict of Holy Purity. They asked her to allow, just once, a marriage to a foreigner. A minor noble from Austria. A merchant's daughter. Anyone with different blood. Marceline, now in her 70s and confined to her wheeled platform, listened in silence. When the delegation finished, she gestured for her scribe. She dictated a single sentence. The circle does not open. The circle does not break. The circle is all we are. If we die holy. The delegation withdrew. 3 months later, Marceline died in her sleep. The official cause was old age. The unofficial cause, whispered by the castle servants, was that her heart had finally given out after 70 years of pumping blood through a body that should never have been born. With her death, the last voice of absolute, unchallenged authority in the Castian March fell silent. Her successor, her grandson Rothhard the Trembling Aribert III, had died of a seizure the previous year, was a different kind of ruler. Rothhard was not wise. He was not pragmatic. He was trembling, copper-poisoned, and utterly convinced of his own divinity. He looked at the population crisis and saw not a warning from God but a test. His response was the Edict of Concentrated Essence, which we mentioned briefly in Part 1. Let us examine it now in full, because it is one of the most horrifying political documents ever written. The Edict of Concentrated Essence 1653. The edict was proclaimed on the first anniversary of Marceline's death. Rothard, his hands shaking so violently that he had to dictate to a scribe, declared the following. Whereas the threadbone blood is the most precious substance in all creation, being the direct vessel of the unbroken circle. Whereas recent decades have seen a diminution in the number of holy births, caused not by any flaw in the blood itself but by the sin of hesitation, the failure to marry quickly enough, to breed often enough, to concentrate the essence with sufficient vigor. Therefore let it be decreed that any threadbone who reaches the age of 14 shall be married within the year to the closest available relative of the opposite sex, as determined by the office of holy descent. Furthermore, let it be decreed that any marriage between threadbones, whose shared ancestry is less than 75% shall be dissolved and the parties remarried to closer kin. Furthermore, let it be decreed that any threadbone who produces fewer than 6 live children by the age of 30 shall be stripped of their rank and housed in the bone chapel as a living penitent. Furthermore, let it be decreed that any child born with a monstrous deformity, defined as any deformity not explicitly listed as holy in the Book of Acceptable Deformities, shall be considered a tithe to God and placed in the chapel's collection immediately upon death. The circle is unbroken. The blood is one. The throne is the womb. So decrees Rothard, by the trembling of his holy hands, which are the hands of God made visible. The edict was carved into a slab of black limestone and mounted in the Great Hall of Schloss am Kenfurt, where it remained until the dynasty's final collapse. It achieved exactly the opposite of what Rothard intended. In the 15 years following the edict, the threadbone population fell from 31 to 19. The birth rate did not increase. If anything, it dropped, because the few remaining fertile couples were now so closely related that their pregnancies almost invariably ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Of the 43 children born between 1653 and 1668, only 7 lived past their first birthday. Of those 7, 4 died before age 10. The 3 who survived to adulthood, a girl named Gertrude, a boy named Odolf, and another boy named Ludolf, were, by threadbone standards, healthy. Which is to say, Gertrude had 6 fingers on each hand wholly, Odolf had a spinal curvature that left him 4 feet tall acceptable, and Ludolf had a hair lip so wide that his upper lip split nearly to his nose also acceptable, because it resembled a sacrificial goat's hoof. These 3 became the genetic founders of the terminal generation, the last gasp of the threadbone dynasty. They were married to each other in every possible combination, producing children who were simultaneously half-siblings, first cousins, double first cousins, and, in one case, genetic clones of their own grandparents. The office of holy descent, now reduced to 3 scribes who were themselves threadbones with holy deformities, kept working. They calculated purity percentages that had become meaningless. When everyone shares 85% of their DNA, the difference between 85% and 87% is statistical noise. They continued to approve marriages. They continued to classify deformities. They continued to believe, even as the bone chapel filled with the remains of their children, that they were building something eternal. They were not building eternity. They were building an extinction event, slowed down to generational speed, and they could not see it because they were inside it. The outside world could see it, though. By 1670, the Castian March had acquired a new name among the few travelers who knew of its existence. They called it Das Verboten Tal, the Forbidden Valley. Not because the threadbones forbade entry, but because anyone who entered and saw what was there felt compelled to forget. The human mind, it turns out, has limits. And the threadbones had found them.